Welcome back to episode 11 of Outgrowing the Good Christian Girl, and I am so excited to interview Sheila Gregoire today, the author of The Great Sex Rescue. Ooh, I'm so excited about this interview. Today, we're going to dive into the research she and her team have done with 20,000 women talking about sex in marriage and what that looks like in a healthy way, and how that's actually, to have a healthy sex life in marriage, you have to deconstruct some of the things that we have been taught in church. So I'm pumped to get to this episode. Sheila is the face behind To Love, Honor, and Vacuum.com, the largest single blogger marriage blog. A sought-after speaker, she's also an award-winning author of 9 books, including The Good Girl's Guide to Great Sex and The Great Sex Rescue. And her podcast, Bare Marriage, has more than 5,000 downloads a week. She and her husband, Keith, live in Belleville, Ontario in Canada. So I'm so excited for you to hear Sheila's interview today. Let's get right to it. Sheila, thank you so much for joining us today. I am so excited to have you on the podcast.
Well, it's great to be here. I'm sure we're going to have a fun chat.
I'm so excited. I have to tell you, my husband and I ordered your book. So I got your book. We had friends over the same night that it arrived, and I hadn't even picked it up, and they had already read the first 3 chapters and ordered it for themselves. So many of my friends are ordering this book, The Great Sex Rescue. It's amazing. All my viewers and listeners, you should order it too. So I'm just super pumped to talk with you today. So I'd like to start each podcast episode by talking about the fruit of our old way of thinking. And this is part of a mini series on sex and purity culture. So we're going to kind of dive in with your subject of expertise here. Because, Jesus said, we know a tree by the fruit that it bears. And so would you tell us, what was your old way of thinking about sex, and what fruit did that bring in your life, whether good or bad?
I think I believed a lot of toxic messages when I first got married, mostly just because they were everywhere in the evangelical church. Things like, my husband needs sex. He can't feel loved unless I give him sex. That's the only way he feels loved. And considering that our story had a lot of sexual pain on my part, that was really toxic, because it's like, the only way he can feel loved is if I let myself be hurt.
Wow.
Yeah, and that took years to unpack.
Oh, yeah. Then let alone you
other
feeling loved in that moment. If you feel like loving means pain,
Exactly. But somehow it always seemed like my needs weren't as important, because we were taught that men's needs were so huge, to the extent that women could never understand them because they were so overwhelming. And so whatever I was feeling, his pain must be worse.
Interesting.
Wow. And I know when we went to get help for the sexual pain that I was experiencing, the therapist, the doctor, the family members we talked to, their concern was, well, how is Keith doing?
Wow.
How is he going to handle it without sex? And so, yeah, he was always the focus of we need to fix Sheila so that Keith can be okay.
Wow. Oh my goodness. That is a heavy weight to bear.
Yes. And so that was probably the biggest example. But, there were other things too. I know that even in the past, because I've been writing about this stuff for 13 years. And I know when I started teaching, I very much taught it along gender lines, taught sex along gender lines. Men need sex and women want affection. And if you really want affection, then you should give sex, because then he'll feel more affection to you. And there is actually there's some truth to that. There is the bonding hormone that we release during sex. It does bring on more affection, et cetera, et cetera. But I had a very transactional view of sex, right? You give things to get what you really want.
Right.
And it's just totally messed up.
Yeah. I think so many of us do have that mindset, though, or just it's almost like a requirement. I think you call it duty sex. It's the idea of obligation, which totally makes you not want it at all, or much less.
No, exactly.
Yeah. So let's take this question from a broader perspective now, because you and your team conducted I don't know the right word for it, an academic level study, maybe it's called, just this amazing study of 20,000 women talking about sex, most of them from a Christian background. So you actually found that there was a whole lot of bad fruit coming out of some of the mainstream teachings about sex in evangelical circles. So would you tell us, what would you say are 2 of the most believed teachings about sex for Christian women? And what is the fruit that has come out of those beliefs?
Sure. Yeah. So what we did, and I want people to understand this because we often get criticism for this. We didn't ask people what hurt you. What we did was we asked people about their marital satisfaction. So we gave them like lots of questions. How happy are you? About their sexual satisfaction. Like we got up close and personal. You know, how often do you orgasm? How do you orgasm? Like all kinds of stuff, right?
Awesome.
Do you get aroused? Does he do enough foreplay? Like everything. And then after that, we asked about a series of typical teachings in the evangelical church to find out if they had ever been taught them or if they had ever believed them. And from there, we were able to compare women who did believe something with women who didn't believe something and see if their marital or sexual satisfaction was affected. And so we ended up identifying 4 big teachings that really hurt sex in particular. And there's other ones that did, but like we focused on 4 in the Great Sex Rescue. But I would say the one that is overarching, that kind of unites them all, like in Lord of the Rings language, you know, the one ring to rule them all kind of thing, comes from, it's typified in a sentence from the book Love and Respect by Emerson Eggerichs, which is the most used marriage study in North American churches. So very, very popular book.
Yeah.
And he says, if your husband is typical, he has a need you don't have. So it's this idea that sex is for men. It's not for women.
Yeah.
And in Love and Respect's chapter on sex, there isn't a single word about the fact that women can feel pleasure too.
Wow.
Not a single word. It's all about how men need physical release and they're going to come under satanic attack if they don't get it.
Oh my goodness. And that's just like, it just misses it for the men too. Like there's so much more to it. Yeah. Wow. That's
I know,
crazy.
it's bizarre.
So would you say, how did you see that affect women in their marriages and their sex lives? You know, in your study, you said you saw the comparisons between beliefs and overall satisfaction.
Well, let me give you 2 examples.
Yeah.
There's one that we studied that said boys will push your sexual boundaries, and we called that the gatekeeper message. And we were looking at what happens when teenage girls believe this and are taught it.
I
and
totally
this is
believe that.
widely taught.
Yeah.
Right. Boys are going to push your boundaries. You need to be the gatekeeper. You need to put the brakes on. Shanti Feldon, for instance, in her book For Young Women Only, she had a survey question where she asked boys this, and this number that I'm about to give you is not actually accurate, okay? Because her survey question was messed up and her answers were messed up.
Okay.
So
good to know.
So I'm not saying this is true, but what she concluded from her survey is that 82% of boys feel little ability and little responsibility to stop in a make-out situation. So if you want to stop, it's better to not even start.
That's definitely
rape
believe
language.
that. Yes. Yes. That is rape language.
Excuse me? I know. Like he has he feels little responsibility to stop.
Oh my gosh.
Like, oh my goodness. And yet this is what we're teaching girls. And what we found is that when girls believed this, their chance of getting aroused or reaching orgasm really fell. And this is funny because chapter 4, it really focuses on this teaching. And it was the one chapter we weren't actually planning on writing.
Wow.
We didn't realize this was a thing.
Wow.
Until we started doing our focus group interviews, and it kept coming up again and again. Women talking about how they had spent their teenage years and their engaged years trying so hard to make sure that he didn't get too turned on, that they taught themselves how not to inhabit their bodies.
Wow.
So one woman said, it's like we would be making out and I felt like I was outside of myself judging what was going on. So I'd be saying, is he getting too excited yet? Do I have to stop it yet? Like, am I doing this right? How's he feeling? So they weren't actually experiencing anything. They were teaching themselves to try to figure out what he was experiencing.
Oh my goodness.
You know, and then you get married and you have no idea what arousal feels like. You have no idea how to just calm down and inhabit your body. And I'm not arguing that we should all like tell teens they need to make out and have fun. But I do think that we need to talk about this in a very different way. And that's what we try to do at the end of each chapter, is give new ways to talk about this. So you don't need to tell teenagers, boys will push your sexual boundaries. What you can do is say to all teenagers, it's normal to want to have sex. It is normal to have sexual feelings, but you need to set boundaries of how far you're wanting to go. And you need to make a plan on how you're going to stick to your boundaries. But even more importantly, you need to honor the boundaries of the person you're with.
Yes.
And if the person you're with doesn't honor your boundaries, that's a red flag that the relationship's not safe. And if we say stuff like that, we teach people how to see red flags.
Yeah, that's so true. I remember when my husband and I were dating, and I remember him being the one who put the brakes on. Natalie, girl, I love you. This is my microphone. I'm interviewing Miss Sheila. I'm going to have you go play with Goma, okay? My girls are, for all my viewers, my girls are a little sick today. Do you want to come up and say hi? Hi, this is Natalie.
Hello.
This is Miss Sheila. So when my husband and I were dating, I remember like him being the one who would put the brakes on a lot of the time. And I was like, what is happening? Like, this is what a good guy does. You know what I mean? Like, it doesn't shirk responsibility, but he's like, I want to honor God. I want to honor you. And it really freed me up to just, like you said, be in the moment and like be present in the experience. And I think that's definitely played a role in our marriage as well, which is really positive.
Yeah, so that's one. The most harmful message that we found was what we called the obligation sex message that we've already touched on. But it's this idea that a wife is obligated to give her husband sex when he wants it. And about 43% of women in our survey reported being taught this before they were married, and 39% said that they entered marriage believing it.
That's a
So
huge
when he
number.
wants sex, when he wants sex, I'm obligated to give it. And that was a message that, so after we did the survey of 20,000 women, we also read the best-selling evangelical marriage and sex books. And so we were looking for some of these messages. And that obligation sex message is everywhere. Like Kevin Lehman in Sheet Music says, there's going to be times it's going to feel forced. You're going to want to push him off of you, but you need to do it because that's what you signed up for.
Oh my gosh.
These kinds of messages are everywhere. And when women believe the obligation sex message, their chance of experiencing sexual pain increases to almost the same extent as if they had been abused.
Oh my goodness.
It's almost the same statistical, like the confidence intervals, there's only 0.1% separating them. So it's very similar. And if you think about that, like this is one of the reasons I believe that Christian women have twice the rate of vaginismus as the general population. So vaginismus is a sexual pain disorder where the muscles in the vaginal wall contract, which makes penetration really painful, if not impossible. And we've known for like 50 years that Christian women suffer from this at way higher rates.
Why has no one been talking about this until now? I'm glad you are. Like, knowing for 50 years and no one said anything?
Yeah, well, in the literature, it's actually interesting because this is an aside, but our book, even though it's selling super well, the Christian establishment has largely ignored it. But the pelvic floor physiotherapists love it, and we're speaking at the physiotherapist convention in February in Texas.
That is so cool.
And we've got articles coming out in physiotherapy journals because until now they didn't know what it was about being religious that caused vaginismus, but we were able to identify several key things. It's not only the obligation sex message, but that's the biggest part of it.
Oh my goodness. That is so cool. I think when like therapists and doctors are recommending your book, like you've hit the nail on the head. So that's so encouraging. Wow. Yeah. I think, can you kind of talk to us about this obligation sex idea? Where do you think this comes from in Christendom? And like, what is it that we think makes this biblical? And can you kind of like turn that on its head for us and tell us what it's really all about?
Sure. Well, it comes from 1 Corinthians 7. That's what people often quote. And so I'll tell you what those verses say, and then I'll tell you why that interpretation's wrong.
Love it.
So
okay.
starting from verse 3, going down into verse 5, it says, a husband must fulfill his marital duties to his wife, and likewise the wife to the husband. And a wife's body does not belong to her alone, but also to the husband, just as a husband's body does not belong to him alone, but also to the wife. And do not deprive each other except by mutual consent and for a time, that you can devote yourselves to prayer and fasting, but then come together again so that Satan won't tempt you for your lack of self-control.
Mm-hmm.
And so people use these verses to say, hey, women, you can't deprive him. But that doesn't mean that there's no way you can get, therefore, every time he wants sex, you need to give it to him from those verses. Because first of all, what is it that we're not supposed to deprive each other of?
I never thought of it like that. Yeah.
And people say, well, sex, you're not supposed to deprive each other of sex. Okay, well, what is sex?
That's a great question. Like, how would you define it? Because I think, I don't know that I've
most
ever heard it
people
defined.
If I were to say to you, like, did you have sex last night? Which I'm not going to ask you, don't worry about that. But if I were to ask you, like, most people think what I'm asking is, did he put his penis into your vagina and move around till he climaxed? So they're picturing intercourse.
Yeah.
But if you think about that definition, he's the one moving, he's the one climaxing, she's not doing much. And she could be lying there making a grocery list in her head, right? Like, not even there. She could be lying there in emotional turmoil. She could even be in physical pain, and it would still count as having sex.
Wow.
And
Good
that
point.
that is not how the Bible talks about sex. Genesis 4 verse 1, there's this really funny verse. It says, Adam knew his wife Eve and they conceived a son. And it's easy to laugh at that and say, oh, God just doesn't want to use the real word.
Right.
But the root to that word, Adam knew his wife, is the same root in the Hebrew where David uses it in the Psalms. Search me and know me, O God. Know my inmost heart. It's this deep longing to be intimate. And so God tells us that sex is more than physical. Sex is a deeply intimate experience. We know from Song of Solomon that it's pleasurable for both. Like, she actually has more words than he does in Song of Solomon. So it's written more from a female point of view. So it's pleasurable for both. And then in 1 Corinthians 7, we get this picture of complete mutuality. So sex is something which is intimate, pleasurable for both, and totally mutual. That's what we're not supposed to deprive each other of.
Wow, that completely changes it.
Yeah, if you're having one-sided intercourse, she's already being deprived, and the verse doesn't even apply.
Oh my goodness, that's so true. Yes.
You know, like it's really, really awful the way we phrase it. And, you know, of the women, first of all, another thing to understand is we have a 47-point orgasm gap.
Yes.
In the church.
Oh my goodness. Can you explain that a little bit too for my viewers?
Yeah, so it means that 95% of men almost always will reach orgasm during a sexual encounter. And we were estimating that number in the Great Sex Rescue, but we have since surveyed Christian men, and it is 95%. So 95% of men almost always reach orgasm in a sexual encounter. The equivalent number for women is about 48. So that's a 47-point orgasm gap. Men are having a lot more fun.
And that's crazy because without a man orgasming, you would think something was wrong. Like, what are we doing wrong? But we don't think that way if a woman isn't.
Right. Her experience is just a bonus, and she's supposed to enjoy it just for the closeness.
Right.
But if you look at the women who do reach orgasm regularly, only about 40% do so through intercourse alone. Most need a whole lot of other stuff, and most find other routes to orgasm far more reliable. So when we define intercourse as sex, then we're really erasing her experience.
Interesting. Wow.
And so many women tell us that they told us they felt broken because intercourse doesn't do anything for them. But they felt guilty. Like if their husband tried foreplay for 2 minutes and they really weren't getting anywhere, they would feel guilty and they would say, it's okay, just go ahead. And so nobody is prioritizing her pleasure or understanding how God made women's bodies to work.
Yes. And really it's going to take more than 2 minutes, for a lot of people, especially when you're learning yourself. It takes a while to discover yourself and what works for you. Okay. Wow. Okay. So let's go back to that. You were saying, a lot of women think, or people say it's just about her comfort. Orgasm is an added bonus. I've actually had women write and say that to me. It's just, I enjoy it because of the closeness. And I guess for me, like, I really want to orgasm too. Like, it's way more fun. So I don't know, like, what would you say in that situation? What are your thoughts on that?
I'm a little bit, okay, this is one of those funny questions where I would answer very differently if you're not married versus if you've been married for 20 years. If you're not married, I would say your orgasm matters, honey. Get it figured out from day one. Like figure this out. Do not aim for intercourse on the wedding night. Aim for comfort. Aim for arousal, and then figure out how to bring you to orgasm before you try intercourse. And it's going to set you on such a better trajectory over your marriage. And remember that your pleasure matters too. God gave you a body part where the only purpose is pleasure. The clitoris has as many nerve endings in it as the penis, and think about how much smaller it is. Like that's a thing. And women don't have a refractory period the way men do, which means that after we reach orgasm, we can keep going where he can't. So women are actually the more sexual ones. So do not like this is a wonderful thing God created for you. If a woman's been married for 10 years and orgasm has been difficult, I would not give that same message because I don't want to. I know so many women do struggle with this, and that's why I've written an orgasm course. It's available at my site.
That just came out, right? I think I saw you teasing on your Instagram. That looks so cool.
Yeah, and I know that a lot of women have struggles with this, and I don't want to add to those struggles, but I would say that I think part of the issue is that we do think it's acceptable for women not to reach orgasm. And we don't realize that you actually were designed to. And the reason that God put the clitoris outside the vagina, he could have stuck it up there, where you get maximum stimulation through intercourse. And there are things you can do to increase the stimulation during intercourse, but God intended for men to have to serve women during sex. Women take a lot longer to reach orgasm than men do, which means men have to spend time pleasuring women. And the way that women tend to reach orgasm is when we're a little bit selfish. We have to concentrate on what we're feeling.
Yeah.
Whereas for sex to work well for both of you, men have to concentrate also on what you're feeling and not on what they're feeling, so they can last a little longer. So like women are supposed to be served during sex. That's how our bodies were actually designed.
Wow. And like the messages in our culture have that completely opposite. It's like the total reverse with the gatekeeper mentality.
Yep.
That's crazy.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
No, and I just think we need to prioritize our own pleasure, because what often happens is women can do that. There's about a 15 to 18 year window where women can say, no, I'm happy with just the closeness. But then you get to a certain age, and it's often in your early 40s or as menopause approaches, and you realize I have just spent my best sexual years not having good sex. And now I just feel cheated. And a lot of women who never reach orgasm just stop having sex altogether, or they get really bitter, or bad stuff happens. So it's like we can cover over it for a number of years, but we can't do it our whole lives.
Interesting.
And it's better to get this, to work at it now and figure this out now.
Is that something else you talked about in your study, or is that just a separate?
That's just something, that one's not in the book.
Oh, okay. I was like, I don't remember that, but okay.
Yeah. But just in talking to a lot of women and in a lot of other things, I've read a lot of other people's stuff that is really common. And when you look at the age cohorts, when we follow the age cohorts and the frequency of sex, as women get older, if they're not orgasming, sex really drops off.
Wow. That is so interesting. Okay, so I have a follow-up question with going back a little bit. You were saying women need to be a little selfish, and I completely agree. But can you kind of talk about that? Because I think as Christian women, we're told we're not supposed to be selfish and never to put our needs first. And can you kind of talk about where does this whole idea of like deconstructing some of these unhealthy beliefs, where does that idea come from, and what does the Bible actually teach us about that?
Yeah, so I think what's really important to understand is that our physical bodies show us something of what God intended. And the fact that most women don't reach orgasm when they're focused on pleasing their husbands. Now, it's not that you can't. Like sometimes you just have a super sexy night where you're whatever. Like,
right.
go for it. Okay. I'm talking big generalities here. But in general, for a woman to reach orgasm, she needs significant time where he is spending stimulating her in some way. And she just does. And the problem is, if he's stimulating her at the same time as she is also like doing stuff to him, often it's not registering for her, because in order to feel pleasure, we actually have to think about it. We have to concentrate in our bodies. It's like the practice of mindfulness, where you just pay attention to what your body is feeling, and you kind of get out of your head a bit. So instead of thinking about what's he thinking, what am I thinking, what are we doing next, you don't ask yourself those questions. You just simply concentrate on what you're feeling, and you just live in the moment. And that's how orgasm can overtake you, because for women to orgasm, we need to be able to let go of control. Like, you need to let it carry you along. If you're trying to be in control, if you're trying to make it happen, it doesn't tend to happen. And I actually think there's something that God's trying to teach us in that too. Because, that pinnacle of pleasure, you kind of lose a lot of ability for very deliberate conscious thought, and you become more feeling, you become more caught up in passion. And that's what God wants for us as well, is to be caught up in passion with him and not to feel like we need to be so in control. And so you need to be able to just inhabit your body and experience. And that's how God made us. And it isn't selfish to do that, because he only needs about 2 to 3 minutes to orgasm, and you probably need 14 to 20. And that's how you were made. And I think that when people try to do, like, we talked about a problem with Tim Keller's book, The Meaning of Marriage, in Great Sex Rescue, where they were just finding it too stressful to aim for her orgasm. And so they decided to concentrate on what they could both give rather than what they can both get. But that means that he still gets to orgasm.
That's not two-sided. That's
no,
not that
like
mutual piece.
It sounds like it is, but it isn't in reality.
Yeah.
Because in reality, in order for her to feel good, she actually does have to focus on what she's getting.
Yeah.
And that's the way God made her body. That's not a selfish thing.
So I'm loving these thoughts. Okay, so another question for you. Many of us women, myself included, have been taught that our husbands need sex, like you were saying before, and we have to fulfill their needs to help them stay pure so that they don't look at porn, they don't cheat, and all that. And you would say that that teaching is very harmful and has brought some bad fruit. So would you tell us what is problematic about this idea and why? And follow-up question, what does the Bible actually teach us about each spouse? You would say in your book, taking responsibility for their own purity.
Right. Yeah, so this is another big teaching. You need to have sex with your husband regularly so he doesn't watch porn, so he's not tempted. In Gary Thomas's latest book, Married Sex, he talked about how if you send nude photos to your husband, then neurologically his brain will focus on your naked body and not want to look at other naked bodies. Like, really problematic stuff. Okay. Kevin
Is that
Lehman
even
said,
true?
No, it's not true.
Okay. Thank you. It's like, just clarify this for me.
No, no, what it does is that just it just makes the pornographic style of relating, it reinforces it instead of, it's just really awful. Anyway, Kevin Lehman said, well, you're on your period. That's a really difficult time for him. So your period is hard on your husband.
Please.
Spoken by someone who's never felt cramps or anything, or never leaked at work or something. Anyway. And so you need to give him oral sex or a hand job while you're on your period so that he can withstand pornography better. I can't think of anything less sexy than that message.
Seriously.
And why they think that's going to turn women on is completely beyond me. But this is the message that's given. You know, you need to do all of these things so that he doesn't watch porn. And that makes sex into a threat. So you're having sex under threat. And as soon as you're having sex under threat, you're no longer truly consenting.
That's a good point.
Which is a huge issue.
Yeah.
And sex is supposed to be this intimate knowing. It isn't a using. And porn and sex are not substitutes for one another. They're complete opposites.
Would you
Because
tell us about that?
pornography, yeah, pornography says, I want to use you for my own sexual gratification. And biblical sex says, I want to experience something with you so that I can grow, we can grow together, grow our oneness, grow our intimacy, grow our relationship. One says, I'm using you, and one says, you deeply matter. You know, one says, I want release, and one says, I want you. And those are very different things. If he has a pornographic style of relating, so if he, as Andrew Bauman talks about, he's great too, but you know, if a guy sees sex as a way to get his own needs met and sees you as an object which can further that, then his way of having sex is not going to be intimate. And we need to stop promoting that as the norm for men. And we need to start saying men are capable of just as much intimacy as women are. And women are not porn substitutes. You know, Every Man's Battle, that series of books sold 4 million copies. It literally says to women, be a merciful vial of methadone for him when he quits cold turkey.
Oh my gosh.
Like, literally calls women methadone. I mean, I can't think of anything worse and more dehumanizing. But this is the mentality in our books. And when women believe that, their trust in their husband plummets, their sexual pain rates rise, their orgasm rates fall. And perhaps most interestingly, their belief or their ability to get aroused really falls.
Wow. So could you tell us, like, I know this has been like as you've shared, a very popular teaching in church circles. What does the Bible actually say, though, about each spouse being responsible for their own purity? Would you tell us, like, kind of break this down for us?
Yeah. So, I mean, repeatedly, the Bible tells us to put lust to death. And it says that to the person who is sinning. It doesn't say to use someone else to placate yourself. It says to put lust to death. And in lists of sins, lust is not always mentioned. It usually is, but it isn't always mentioned. And so this idea that lust somehow is every man's battle, lust is a separate category of sin where it's just kind of part of being male. It's not really a sin because every guy suffers from it. So it's just kind of part of being male, and women just need to kind of live with it and accept it. That isn't biblical. But I think the other side of it, which is what makes me so sad, as a grandmother of a young grandson, I really hope the church gets this better by the time he's a teenager. But I think what's happened in the church is that we have confused noticing with lusting.
Yes. Oh my goodness. My husband and I talk about that a lot. Yeah.
Yeah, like Jesus said, whoever looks at a woman with lust has already committed adultery. He didn't say whoever notices a woman is beautiful. He didn't say whoever feels attraction towards a woman walking by.
Right.
He didn't say whoever, sees that a woman has a large bust has already lusted. He just said whoever, it's a deliberate action. So looking with a deliberate mindset, lusting. It's not, so seeing isn't lusting, noticing isn't lusting, feeling attraction is not lusting. You can notice someone is good looking and then have that have absolutely no bearing on the rest of your day, on any other thought life, on anything. And that should be the norm. And instead, we are so hyper-focused on telling boys that lust is going to be your battle and you can't, and you need to constantly fight it. And then telling girls how hard this is on guys. And so you need to change how you dress. Yeah. Instead of just saying, hey, you know what? It's normal to have sexual feelings towards other people. But what we all need to do is focus on how we can treat everybody with respect.
That's so good. There's so many directions I want to go right now. I'm going to start. So about 65% of my viewers are single women. And so I have a few questions geared toward the single ladies. The first one I want to go with is let's talk about the modesty piece for a second. You said, that's a big part of purity culture too. What women are taught about how guys see us, it's our responsibility to keep them from lusting. Can you kind of talk about that from a more biblical perspective? for us?
Yeah, like first of all, modesty does not actually refer to clothing. Like everyone quotes the First Timothy
Yes.
2 verses about how women should dress modestly, but if you look at the context, it's talking about gold jewelry and braided hair and expensive clothing. It was about class. And it was about people feeling excluded when they came to the church. And modesty does not just refer to cleavage. It also refers to ostentatious displays where you're trying to draw attention to yourself. And so Paul is saying, hey, don't try to draw attention to yourself. Because there was a big class problem in the church where poorer people didn't feel comfortable and were feeling excluded. And there's also some debate on what braided hair meant in those days and stuff like that. But he's just saying, look, like, let's just all be welcoming. Let's dress so that we're welcoming to people so that people feel at ease. And I think that's a very good rule or guideline or whatever we want to follow on how we should approach how we dress is let's be welcoming. Let's put people at ease. And that means that being hyper modest is actually the opposite of what Paul's talking about.
That's so true.
Like, if you go around in long denim skirts and baggy t-shirts,
you are drawing attention to
you're not
yourself.
going to put people at ease. Like, people are going to feel like you're weird and I don't know what to do with you. And so that is just as bad in many ways as the other. So I always think, okay, being modest means not being ostentatious and making people feel uncomfortable. So that means I'm just going to look at what the current fashions are and I'm going to be somewhere in the middle and I'm good. It's not about number of inches that are showing,
Right.
below your collarbone or anything like that. It's just like, I think this is so funny too. Like people who say, oh, women can't wear 2-piece bathing suits to youth groups or you can't wear leggings or whatever. Well, then what are guys supposed to do when they're in the real world?
Yeah, that's so true.
Like, if your guy really can't handle the real world, then he should never be going out of the house. It's not about girls dressing differently in church. It's that he should never be going out of the house. If everybody just dresses what the current fashion is, you'd be fine. Like missionaries who go to some tribes, wherever it is where women go topless, they find they adjust. Because when you see stuff all the time, it just isn't a big deal.
Right. Yeah.
And it's how people treat or consider different body parts. And I think having much more of a we're going to make people feel comfortable is a far better guideline. And that's really more in line with what Paul was talking about.
I love that. Okay, my second question for single women is, I think a lot of us, myself included, grew up hearing this idea that he will have eyes for only me. So as you're talking about noticing versus lusting, I think there's this thing in many of us that's like, but if he really loves me, he won't be noticing the other girls around. Would you kind of speak to that for a minute?
Yeah, and I've gotten into debates with women on the blog too, that somehow if he's noticing, it means that he hasn't been fully redeemed, or we should judge beauty the same way God does, which is from the heart. But there's a difference between a thought entering your head and you actually engaging with that thought. And when we notice something, that's not a conscious thing. That's just done on a certain level. And there's cross-cultural studies that have shown that certain waist to hip ratios men tend to find them attractive across all cultures. It's just hardwired.
Huh.
Yeah. And people have wondered if it has to do with, like, it's a sign of greater fertility or something. I don't know. But like, does it really matter? And this is the thing, because we want men to treat us with respect. We want men to treat us like, to love us and to have truly intimate relationships with us and have it not just be based on sex. If you want a man to do that, then you need to believe that even if he finds another woman attractive, that doesn't actually matter, because that's not the main thing he's thinking about. And it's just like, my husband and I joke about this a lot. Like, I think Ryan Reynolds is hot. Totally think he's hot. If he showed up at my door and wanted to kiss me, I would be totally grossed out. Like, you can think, someone is hot and have it totally not matter.
That is a great point. Yeah. Yeah.
And it doesn't impact how I feel about my husband at all. And I think when we hyper focus on it, like he's not allowed to think anyone else is attractive, then we're actually putting a lot more emphasis on attraction than we should as well. Because if we think the real issue is intimacy, then you need to believe that the guy that you're with is also going to feel that way. Now, that being said, if a guy is totally checking out other women and thinking that's okay, that's not okay. So I'm saying this with a big caveat.
Yeah.
I'm saying a guy who treats you well, where you have a good relationship, where he honors your boundaries. If he also finds Gal Gadot hot in Wonder Woman, if he's not doing anything with that information, I mean, I find Gal Gadot hot in Wonder Woman. Like, I don't know.
Yeah, that's fair. Yeah, I think that's a good point. It's like, what does he do with it? And if it's like he's staring and ogling her, that's one thing, but noticing is very different and very normal. Yeah, and when we act like it's not normal, that puts a huge pressure on guys that they were not meant to have.
And a lot of guys' lust problems really are caused by hypervigilance. Like when we tell men you're never allowed to notice, and this is what we do to teenage boys, right? We basically tell them any sexual feelings they have are sin, right at a time where they are having a whole time they can't control. And so they feel like I am hardwired to sin, which I think is why so many Christian men really do struggle with lust, because from the very beginning, they've been told this, and so they get hyper vigilant trying not to lust, but as soon as you try not to notice, you notice even more.
Right.
If we simply focus on how can we treat each other with respect, it really isn't as much of a problem.
That's a good point. Yeah. Wow. Okay, so I have two last questions for you. One is, what can a woman do to heal her perspective towards sex? What are like some practical steps she could take towards healing, whether she's single or married? And they might be different steps for each category or the same, but what would you recommend?
Well, first of all, this is a little self-serving, but read The Great Sex Rescue.
Absolutely.
I'm amazed at how many single people have read it.
Yeah.
I wasn't expecting that. I'm also amazed at how many men have read it. I wasn't expecting that either.
My husband loved it. He read it before I did. Yeah. He was like, this is awesome.
We were always told by publishers that men don't read books written by women. So like we really didn't.
Oh, wow. That's sexist. That's crazy.
Not our publisher in particular, but just like over the years I've been told that. But anyway, so that was thrilling. But a lot of single people, a lot of divorced women have been reading it, just saying that it helped them to see that what happened in their marriage was not from God. Because I think that's where we get really messed up, is when we feel objectified, but then we also feel like God is the one doing it.
Yeah.
So this idea that all men struggle with lust, therefore you need to have sex so that he doesn't struggle. It's now God saying, you need to use your body to keep him from sinning. So God's the one objectifying me. And that's a very spiritually abusive message. And for women who are really struggling, it's like that now stole God. I now have no safe place because God was my safe place and you took that from me.
Wow.
So people have found that really healing. I think step 2, what I would recommend is write out your sexual story. And I don't mean like your sexual history of what you've done with guys, but I mean, when did you first have sexual feelings? What was the context of it? What happened when you were 10, 11, 12, when your body started to change? How did you feel about that? Like when we start to understand, was this a good thing or a bad thing? Are there certain things I've always felt shame over? What made me feel shame? How did I feel when I was a young teenager? Because that goes with us. What are the messages I've been told in church? And when we can start looking at it clearly, it's like, oh, no wonder I messed up in this area. Or, oh, no wonder I have bad posture. I've been trying to hide my boobs my whole life.
Yes, totally did that. Yeah. A guy friend called me on it. It's like, why are you doing that? I'm like, because I don't want guys looking at my boobs and struggling. It's crazy. Yeah. Now I have back problems. Anyway, you can continue. Sorry.
Yeah.
Not to interrupt you.
It's like, but then you realize, hey, it wasn't my fault. I can have compassion on myself rather than just feeling mad at myself for being messed up.
Yeah, that's good. Now, kind of to piggyback off of that, my last question for you is, would you tell my listeners about some resources, both yours, because you have a whole bunch of amazing resources, and then any others that you'd recommend as well as they work to develop this healthy, truly biblical perspective and mindset towards sex. And just to keep in mind, I have a mostly single women, but a good number who are also engaged or newly married. So what would you recommend?
Rachel Joy Welcher wrote a great book talking back to purity culture.
Ooh.
Which is really good. I'd read that. The Where Do We Go From Here podcast is really interesting. It's again talking back to purity culture, and if we're not gonna believe purity culture, then what do we believe? How do we go forward if we still want to walk with God? Like, what's left then? So that's an interesting podcast that I've been enjoying as well. And I think just reading things that help us understand who we are as women. The Making of Biblical Womanhood is a great book by Beth Allison Barr, not necessarily about sex. Yeah, but just understanding how this whole idea of maleness and femaleness got started in the church, and how it really got warped, and how we can rediscover that the point isn't to be a biblical man or a biblical woman. The point is to look like Jesus, and you can do that no matter what gender you are.
Yeah. And then can you tell us about your resources as well? I know you mentioned a couple already, but you can kind of like tell us about them all.
Yes. So obviously The Great Sex Rescue, I highly recommend that for everyone. It's healing. It's fun. It's fascinating. You're going to want to chuck the book against the wall so many times when you start reading all the quotes where we're quoting other books, and you're going to be like, no way, they didn't really say that.
That's what my husband did. He's like, I cannot believe this was written. He's like, this went through how many editors and publishers, and everyone approved it. Yeah. It's crazy.
So we've got that. We've got an orgasm course and a boost your libido course if you're married and struggling in this area. So those are fun.
Amazing.
And then in the new year, the new edition for The Good Girl's Guide to Great Sex, I rewrote it. It's 10 years since I wrote the first one. I completely rewrote it. Wow. And then my husband and I wrote The Good Guy's Guide to Great Sex, which has a lot of our survey results from men, and that's coming out in the new year as well.
Ooh, those sound amazing. I'll be looking for those. Yeah. Wow. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today. And definitely to all of you, check out Sheila's books and the resources she mentioned. They're all linked in the description below. And that book, The Great Sex Rescue, is a game changer. So I'll see you all next week for another episode of Outgrowing the Good Christian Girl. And thank you so much, Sheila.
Thank you.
Bye.